The progesterone should be progesterone that's identical to what's in humans' bodies, and there is only one of those, although actually there's metabolites of progesterone, but it's progesterone itself. There's just one of those. If we're going to copy nature, what do ovaries do? Well, let's see. They have a monthly cycle. There's a bleeding cycle where both estrogen and progesterone are quite low. Not non-existent, but low. Then, first, here comes estrogen. Comes on fairly strongly. Progesterone, yes, it comes on, but only a little bit, until we get to what's called generally mid-cycle. At that time, there's this big surge of both estrogen and progesterone. It's called the mid-cycle peak. Now, for some of us, we're familiar with the method of birth control called the rhythm method, and we take our temperature every day if we're the lady, and we look for that temperature going up, and that's when ovulation occurs, and if we don't want to get pregnant or we do want to get pregnant, we better behave accordingly. All right. Well, at that point, the estrogen surges for a day or two, but the progesterone surges almost for the rest of the menstrual cycle and stays up there. The estrogen comes promptly back down. Now, why? It comes back down to the levels it was before that ovulatory peak, as it's called. Why does progesterone stay up there? Well, let's examine the name progesterone. What does it mean? It's from the Greek. It means to support gestation. Progesterone. What's gestation? It's growing a baby. So, if we're going to support that, we've got to have a lot of around, just in case there's a fertilized ovum and it implants in mother's uterus. We've got to support it with lots of progesterone. So the progesterone stays high. Now, if there wasn't any conception happening, then just before the menstrual period, boop, progesterone drops down to really low again, and so does the estrogen. So that's when the bleeding cycle happens again. Okay, well, if we're going to copy nature, we want to bring in estrogen right after the bleeding cycle, or if it's a postmenopausal woman, we make believe there's a bleeding cycle. Now, we don't necessarily have to have one, and that's a matter of debate, that's true. But why do we make believe? Why do we have to have 3 or 4 days with no estrogen or progesterone at all? Because that's the way nature designed things, to have estrogen, progesterone at a very low level for anywhere from 3 to 5 or 6 days. And there are things called estrogen and progesterone receptors, and they get a break once a month for the entire time a woman's having her menstrual cycles. Once a month, those receptors get a break.
Now, is that 3 to 6 days in a row?
It's usually 3 or 4 days. We don't have to go clear out to 6.
Mm-hmm.
And some women say, well, if I cut my hormones out for 3 or 4 days, I feel bad. Those are usually women who are just going through menopause, just at that time. And we'll tell them, well, okay, cut them in half anyway. Give your receptors some of a break. So cut them in half so you don't feel so bad, but you've got to give those receptors a break. Here's why. In experimental animals, even when the anti-carcinogenic estrogen, estriol, is used, if we ignore that animal's what's called estrus cycle, which is the cycle that that animal has, and just keep giving the estriol, the anti-carcinogen, day after day after day, and we ignore and don't give any break, after a while, those animals start getting more cancers. So nature doesn't like having those hormones around all the time. Now, question of do we need to have a bleeding cycle, that one's actually been researched. It was a 5-year research study done by scientists at the University of Southern California and over in France, or France, depending on your accent.
France, monsieur, France.
There you go. And what they did, they had some brave research volunteer ladies, because those ladies volunteered for a period of 5 years to take estrogen cycled with progesterone, to have bleeding cycles. Some of them took high enough doses to have bleeding cycles, and some of them didn't. But that wasn't the brave part. The brave part was they all had biopsies of the endometrium on a regular basis.
Wow.
Looking for cancer cells. And they also, of course, had breast exams and mammograms and all that kind of stuff for 5 years. So these were kind of brave, persistent volunteers. Congratulations to them. And at the end of that study, the authors' names, for those who are interested, are Moyer, M-O-Y-E-R, and Deliniers, and I don't know if I can pronounce that, or spell that. Anyway, At the end of that study, they concluded it didn't make any difference whether it was bleeding or not, because none of the endometrial biopsies in either group went abnormal. And they were using bioidentical estrogen, and they were using bioidentical progesterone. Aha! And this is back in the 80s or 90s. So it appears from an actual 5-year study with biopsies and stuff, and also mammograms, that it is not absolutely necessary to have bleeding to get the job done. To have menstrual bleeding, one is on a higher dose, and some women prefer to be on a higher dose and prefer to have those cycles. But when I'm speaking with, let's say, a room full of folks who want to hear about bioidentical hormones, I usually ask, how many people would like to have your menstrual cycle till you're 93 years old if you have an alternative? I don't get very many volunteers, oddly enough. But it's certainly up to that woman's preference. Okay, so we put in the estrogen and progesterone on that cyclic sort of basis. Now let's go over to DHEA. DHEA is not made in the ovaries. It's made in the adrenal glands. And the adrenal glands make DHEA every day. That is, after we go into puberty. They don't make much before then. All right, so if nature does it every day, and the receptors are accustomed to having it every day, then if we're going to copy nature, and we're least likely to get into trouble if we copy nature, I didn't say we're never going to get into trouble, but we're least likely to, then we have the DHEA taken every day, but we follow up with tests. You just pointed out the correct thing. Some women, and it's a minority, will metabolize their DHEA into testosterone. Many women don't to any degree, but you don't know before you start. And testosterone is something that women need in women's quantities as much as men need it in men's quantities. Just as a parenthetical here, that's why there's so many more little old ladies than little old men. Oh, no, that's not entirely because men die sooner than women. It's because testosterone is responsible for muscle mass in both genders. It's the same hormone. And men, by nature, have more testosterone. So we have more muscles way longer into our lives, even if our testosterone levels decline. And ladies, I've actually had occasion to work with a couple women, who had virtually zero testosterone floating around. And one of them, of course, had heart failure. Heart's a big old muscle, and it's going to fail if it doesn't have the support from testosterone. And the other was just, I just can't lift anything. I'm not strong like I used to be, et cetera, et cetera. And even though she was 70, when she got her testosterone back, she was able to bulk up a little for a lady, not for a guy, but for a lady.
And it's very minute trace amounts. Is that correct? That you're basically?
Not really, because remember what in women's bodies do with testosterone. Turns out that in both men and women, estrogen is made directly out of testosterone. So women's bodies have the enzymes that are very, very efficient at taking most of that testosterone and turning it into estrogen. We don't want too much of that guy stuff around. Whereas men's bodies, as any women will tell you, are slow and have some of the enzyme to make estrogen out of testosterone, but it doesn't go real fast. That's why guys don't get breasts. And so when men take a dose of testosterone, most of it stays home as testosterone and only a little bit leaks over into estrogen. But when women take a dose of testosterone, zip, about 80% of it becomes estrogen. So that's approximation. It varies from woman to woman. So one has to use, it's a surprise to many women, but the dose of testosterone is sometimes as high as the dose of estrogen, and she'll say, excuse me, what are you doing giving me as much testosterone as estrogen? I don't want to grow a mustache. And I tell her, you won't. Most of that testosterone is going to end up being estrogen, so I had to cut back the estrogen dose because you're using testosterone. And that's just the way nature goes.
Who comes up with the criteria for what is the new normal or what is the anti-aging optimal levels? Is that
Nature did.
Pardon?
Nature did. Copy nature. Women in their menstrual years have levels of estrogens that go from here to up there. So as long as we stay within the range of the low end of here to the high end of up there, and we stay within that range, we're least likely to get into trouble.
Is that a particular age range as well that you're looking